The Blade God was the war god revered by the followers of the Berserk Saber of the Sixth Martial Arts sect. In ages past, countless martial artists had known him as the greatest martial artist under heaven. Both the Orthodox Martial Arts Alliance and the demonic cult had long learned through their spies that the Berserk Saber of the Sixth Martial Arts sect were descendants of the Blade God. Yet that knowledge was only the surface. No one outside the sect knew the true secret concealed within the Berserk Saber of the Sixth Martial Arts sect. Chun Yo-won's voice boomed across the plains as he denounced the Blade Lord for fleeing after his defeat by sacrificing his own subordinates. He declared that people like them were unworthy of leadership, let alone worthy of questioning him, before dismissing the Blade God as nothing more than a fake. As he was carried away, the Blade Lord remained silent. Watching him closely, Hwang Heol noticed the Blade Lord's body trembling. Even they harbored overwhelming anger and hatred toward the demon god, and he realized the Blade Lord's fury had to be far greater. The only reason it remained unseen was because the Blade Lord was suppressing his rage to focus entirely on circulating his chi. Deep within, the Blade Lord forced himself to concentrate on expelling the violent energy lodged inside his body. Once that energy was driven out, his physical recovery would accelerate. If everyone present perished, the Berserk Saber of the Sixth Martial Arts sect would suffer a devastating blow from which it could never recover. Finally, the Blade Lord demanded to know what it was that Chun Yo-won wished to learn from him. At that moment, Yo-won's eyes sharpened as NANO informed him that the injured man's internal energy remained exceptionally active. Mentally, Yo-won immediately understood the situation. The Blade Lord was merely stalling for time while expelling the foreign energy that had invaded his body. He recalled attempting to extract information from Blade Master Lee Baek through hypnosis and drugs, only for Lee Baek to lose his mind after speaking a few words. Although the Blade Lord, as the sect's leader, was less likely to suffer the same fate, Yo-won could not be certain. He decided it would be better to pretend he had been deceived while subtly drawing answers from him. A faint smile crossed Yo-won's face as he asked whether the Blade Lord truly knew the future, reminding him that he had claimed he would kill him and change what was yet to come. Could such a thing truly be possible? The question was born from a modest hypothesis. If someone returned to the past, what would they do to alter the course of history? Chun Yo-won's own descendant had injected him with nanomachines. If the Blade God had genuinely come from the future, then it was highly probable that those claiming to be his descendants had likewise inherited something from the future Blade God himself. Hwang Heol was struck speechless. Inside, disbelief overwhelmed him as he wondered how the demon god could possibly know such a secret. Only a tiny handful of people within their sect were even aware of that truth. The Blade Lord immediately transmitted a telepathic message to Hwang Heol, demanding to know whether the records left behind by that person had somehow been leaked. Hwang Heol firmly denied the possibility. No outsider had ever infiltrated the sect's stronghold, and even if those records had somehow fallen into another's hands, only the two supreme elders and Hwang Heol himself possessed the ability to properly read them. Yo-won recalled hearing something similar from his grandfather. If his assumption was correct, then the characters they claimed could not be properly read were most likely simplified characters used in the future. That meant the document his grandfather had painstakingly transcribed had to be the very records they were discussing now. Through telepathy, Hwang Heol insisted to the Blade Lord that it was absolutely impossible for the demon god to know about those records. The Blade Lord was about to dismiss the certainty of the word absolute before a sudden realization struck him. Deep down, his thoughts raced through the records left behind by that mysterious person. According to those records, Chun Yo-won should still have been in the era when he was merely the young cult leader of the demonic cult. That was precisely why the Blade Lord had acted against Chun Yu-jong from the very beginning, intending to prevent him from ever becoming the young cult leader. Although that mysterious person's intervention in the past had caused certain events to differ from the records, the Blade Lord had paid little attention to those discrepancies. Even if history had begun unfolding faster than expected, the demon god had still appeared to be following the predicted course. The records had repeatedly warned him never to lower his guard, prompting him to accelerate the sect's grand plan. Yet everything had gradually unraveled. Time after time, that troublesome bastard had interfered with the grand plan, costing him the Fire Kirin's core, the Dragon Turtle's core, and even the White Wind Tiger's core. At last, the Blade Lord realized his original assumption had been wrong from the very beginning. It was never because the demon god had surpassed expectations as the reincarnation of the heavenly demon. Consumed by rage, the Blade Lord declared that the demon god also knew the future. Yo-won calmly observed that the Blade Lord had arrived at an entirely different conclusion. conclusion. Even though he had completely misunderstood the situation, there was no reason to correct him. Instead, Yo-won remarked that the Blade Lord was remarkably perceptive and reminded him that if he understood that much, he should also know that deceiving him was impossible. Hwang Hee-yeol urgently transmitted another telepathic message, insisting that such a thing was impossible. The records clearly stated that unless someone removed the object inside their body, they would be detected by the Time Patrol. Because of that, no one other than that person himself could intervene in the past. The moment the words Time Patrol reached him, Yo-won's eyes narrowed. Thanks to his ability to overhear telepathic messages, he had heard every word of their exchange. The term was familiar. It had been mentioned by the doctor in NANO's recorded video, and even his own descendant, Director Chun, had shown concern whenever it was brought up. Pondering the revelation, Yo-won concluded that although he did not know exactly what the Time Patrol was, it appeared to be an existence that prevented people from the future from interfering with the past. That would explain why his descendant had injected nanomachines into his body before disappearing in such haste. Then another thought struck him. If that were true, did it mean the person they kept referring to had remained in the past? Everything suddenly began falling into place. It had always seemed strange that traces of the Blade God, who had first appeared during the era of the demonic sword Heavenly Demon, also existed as far back as the age of the Heavenly Demon founder. He had been thinking about it all wrong. The answer was obvious. The Blade God had traveled to an even more distant past. Yo-won stated that the person they kept referring to was the Blade God. At that very instant, a black haze burst from the Blade Lord's body as the violent energy he had been suppressing was finally expelled. Without hesitation, the Blade Lord declared that the Demon God had to die there and then. A terrifying surge of energy erupted as space itself twisted around the Blade Lord's hand. Combining his own immense power with the Great Bird's ice chi, he launched a decisive attack meant to kill Yo-won. Then, in an instant, Black Thunder chi crackled into existence, forming an invisible sword before Yo-won. Yo-won coldly mocked the Blade Lord for walking straight into his trap. He revealed that he had known all along the Blade Lord had been secretly circulating his chi and calmly declared that he himself had remained in perfect condition the entire time. The surrounding space twisted as every ounce of energy converged onto the tip of the invisible sword forged from Black Thunder Chi. The Blade Lord's eyes widened in disbelief. Unification! After suffering defeat at the hands of the God of the East, the Blade Lord had secluded himself for 20 years before finally mastering that supreme secret technique. It compressed space and time, condensing countless movements into a single strike. Yet the demon god, Chun Yo-won, who was barely 20 years old, wielded that very same supreme technique. But before he could finish expressing his disbelief, black lightning exploded forth. Crackling thunder engulfed the battlefield as the beam crashed toward him. With no time to hesitate, the Blade Lord desperately unified the energy gathered in his hand to meet the attack. Yo-won's voice remained cold as he declared that the Blade Lord should abandon any hope of regeneration. The black lightning tore through the Blade Lord's attack without mercy before swallowing his body whole. His agonized screams echoed across the battlefield, fierce and chilling at first, only to fade away until complete silence remained. Nothing was left behind except the scorched marks burned into the earth by the black lightning. The surrounding masters froze in horror, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Hwang Hee-yeol and the others desperately searched for the Blade Lord, crying out for him, but not a single trace remained. In despair and fury, they demanded to know what the demon god had done to their lord. A faint smirk appeared on Yo-won's face as he answered that he had erased the Blade Lord from the world completely. The loss of their leader filled the remaining masters with an overwhelming sense of emptiness, and that despair quickly transformed into fear. Yo-won calmly declared that only they remained. Rather than fleeing so pathetically, he advised them to either face him in a proper fight or surrender. Hwang Hee-yeol clenched his teeth in rage at the warning, but reality was merciless. No amount of anger could reverse what had already happened. Turning toward the masters whose faces had turned pale and whose bodies trembled with cold sweat, Hwang Hee-yeol ordered everyone to scatter in every direction. As he fled, only one thought occupied his mind. It did not matter who survived. Even if only a single person escaped, the sect could endure. If the demonic cult succeeded in attacking their stronghold, everything the Berserk Saber of the Six Martial Arts sect had built would collapse. Watching them scatter scatter, Yo-won remarked that they truly refused to give up. Then again, if an organization collapsed simply because its leader had died, it would never have survived this long. Quietly assessing himself, he determined that only about 20% of his true chi remained. White particles drifted from the soles of the NANO suit as Yo-won slowly rose into the air. He lifted both hands toward the sky. An overwhelming wave of extreme yin spread outward. The temperature plummeted and frost rapidly engulfed the surroundings. The gathering frost condensed until 27 ice swords floated around him. For the moment, that was his limit. Any further expenditure of internal energy had to be restrained. He silently ordered NANO to track them. NANO immediately acknowledged the command and activated the remote panel system. The moment NANO finished speaking, with a resonant hum, the swords forged from extreme cold chi transformed into brilliant blue blades before surging relentlessly toward their targets. One master's sword shattered after only 2 exchanges with a single air sword, and before he could react, another pierced straight through his chest. The others fared no better. One after another, they were cut down as enormous blue-winged swords hunted them without pause. Within NANO's augmented reality, each designated target disappeared in succession. Only a single red marker remained. It belonged to Hwang Heol. Wrapped in bloodstained bandages, he alone continued resisting. 3 air swords descended upon him simultaneously. Their combined force shattered his sword, forcing him to defend himself with sword chi projected from his bare hands. The effort cost him dearly. One of the air swords severed his arm completely. Enduring the unbearable agony of losing the limb, Hwang Heol desperately attempted to flee. He never made it. Another air sword pierced straight through his chest. He staggered to a halt and looked down in disbelief. A hole the size of his head had been carved through his chest. His entire body trembled before the last breath left him. Floating high above the battlefield, Yo-won slowly exhaled. Inside, he concluded that only the Berserk Saber of the 6 martial arts sect's headquarters in the Yellow Mountains of Hangzhou Zhejiang remained. Once that base was destroyed, the sect would be completely eradicated. Afterward, he intended to recover the hidden records in Hubei that his grandfather had transcribed and uncover the Blade God's secret. Before all of that, however, he needed to return to the God of the East. Just as Yo-won turned toward Changbai Mountain, a chilling sensation suddenly ran through him. He immediately sensed an unfamiliar surge of energy. It was not especially powerful, yet something about it filled him with unease. His gaze shifted toward the mountain peak. The unnatural silence covering the mountainside only deepened that unsettling feeling. Mentally, Yo-won realized the disturbance had come from the direction of the God of the East. He could hardly imagine anything happening to him, especially after even the Blade Master had been unable to accomplish much against him. Even so, he decided there was no time to waste. Without another moment's delay, Yo-won shot toward Changbai Mountain. His figure vanished into the distance. Not long afterward, shimmering after images rippled through the air beside Hwang Heol's corpse. It was Gul-won, the 3rd divinity of the Berserk Saber of the 6 martial arts sect. He calmly approached Hwang Heol's body before turning it over. Placing 2 fingers against the vein in Hwang Heol's neck, Gul-won carefully checked for any sign of life. A heartbeat. A smile slowly spread across Gul-won's lips. Acknowledging that Hwang Heol had endured, he gathered energy into his fingertips and gently injected it into the blood vessels beside Hwang Heol's dantian. After several unsuccessful attempts, Gul-won reached into his sleeve and withdrew a small jar no larger than a clenched fist. The moment he removed the lid, a putrid stench spread through the air. He brought the jar to Hwang Heol's lips, allowing the dark liquid inside to flow down his throat. Nothing happened. For a brief moment, Gul-won questioned whether Hwang Heol had truly died. Then everything changed. Hwang Heol's eyes, which had rolled back until only the whites were visible, slowly returned to normal. A guttural cry escaped him. The severed veins within his chest began reconnecting like intertwining threads. The regeneration did not stop there. His missing right arm gradually reformed, flesh and bone restoring themselves piece by piece. Even the area around his head, which had long remained hidden beneath bandages, began to swell before fresh hair slowly emerged. Lying on the ground, Hwang Heol pushed himself upright and drew several heavy breaths. Watching the astonishing recovery, the crimson-haired Gul-won smiled and remarked that Hwang Heol had done well before asking how it felt to return from the brink of death. Hwang Heol stared at him in disbelief and replied that Gul-won would never ask such a question if he had experienced death himself. Gul-won calmly responded that it had been difficult to determine whether Hwang Heol had been alive or dead at all. Even though the demon god had not fought with his full power, Hwang Heol had been reduced to a pitiful state. Quietly, Hwang Heol muttered that the demon god was an absolute monster if that had not even been his full strength. Gulwan observed that such words coming from Hwang Heol, the sect's second in command, only proved that the demon god had grown beyond all of their expectations. Hwang Heol bitterly added that the terrifying growth had happened within an incredibly short time. It was as though the demon god became stronger with every breath he took. Gulwan prompted him to continue. Hwang Heol declared that the Blade Master had suffered an utterly overwhelming defeat because the demon god had become far stronger far too quickly. The original flow of history had advanced far ahead of its proper course, making it imperative to stop him. The demon god already possessed 4 of the 5 essence cores, and if he obtained just one more, he would ascend into a realm that no one could ever reach. Gulwan paused at that revelation. According to the reports he had received, only 3 essence cores had fallen into the demon god's hands. Hwang Heol firmly corrected him. He was convinced that the demon god had also absorbed the Great Peng's essence core because he had personally sensed its spiritual chi emanating from him. He immediately asked whether the other members of the 4 divinities had arrived, insisting that every one of them would be needed to stand against the demon god. A faint smile spread across Gulwan's lips. He replied that there was no need for the others. In fact, if Hwang Heol's conclusion was correct, then the situation was even better. He revealed that he was already here. Hearing those words, Hwang Heol's eyes widened in shock. Meanwhile, Yo-won sped toward the mountain peak where the battle had taken place. As he reached the blood-soaked frozen lake, the nano suit slowly descended, bringing him to the ground. The sight before him was beyond belief. Ark-Wui stood there with both of his arms severed. Standing directly before him was a lone man. The man remarked that it was admirable that Ark-Wui still refused to kneel. Despite the words, his voice carried no trace of emotion. It was dry, flat, and utterly devoid of feeling. He calmly walked past Ark-Wui before stopping and turning his emotionless gaze toward Yo-won. He stated that it had been a very long time. Then, correcting himself, he remarked that this was the first time they had crossed paths in this place, addressing Yo-won as the demon god. Yo-won's eyes trembled. The man's strong features and thick eyebrows were unmistakable. It was the very same face Yo-won had seen in the recorded video NANO had shown him. The Blade God had finally appeared. 2 hours earlier, Ark-Wui had been locked in a fierce battle against the martial artists of the Berserk Saber of the 6th martial arts sect. Despite fighting with an injured right arm, he single-handedly annihilated every one of them. Breathing heavily, Ark-Wui let out a long sigh of relief as the battle finally came to an end. Deep within, he reflected that everyone was dead. Though they had been his enemies, he had still taken far too many lives. He quietly wondered whether the White Wind Tiger, Feng Bo, could now say that he had carried a portion of the resentment his old friend had borne for over a century. At that moment, a shadow passed silently behind him. A calm voice remarked that nothing less could be expected from the god of the East. Ark-Wui immediately froze and turned around. Standing behind him was the Blade God. The Blade God observed that even with his right arm injured, defeating opponents of that level was effortless for God of the East. His gaze shifted toward the area below, before remarking that the White Wind Tiger should be there. He casually revealed that he had been unable to finish the White Wind Tiger off because the Time Patrol had been pursuing him at the time, then added that, from Ark-Wui's perspective, that event had taken place 100 years earlier. He finally asked how it felt to witness the death of his friend. The words shattered Ark-Wui's composure. He exploded forward like a bolt of lightning. In less than an instant, he closed the distance and unleashed dozens of devastating punches. The Blade God did not move. As Ark-Wui looked directly into his face, recognition struck him. It was him, the source of Feng Bo's endless resentment. The man who had killed the young White Wind Tiger and Sak-young. The one responsible for the pain and suffering his friends had endured, and for the burden Ark-Wui himself had carried for more than 100 years. Driven by overwhelming fury, Ark-Wui stepped even closer and unleashed another devastating punch. His chi surged into the attack and it appeared to connect. But the Blade God had already moved. Ark-Wui was stunned. Privately, he admitted that the Blade God had not suffered so much as a scratch, though he had expected as much. There was no longer any room to hold back. He slammed his foot into the ground. The earth beneath him shattered. Arc Wui's internal energy erupted as he resolved to pour everything he possessed into a single attack. He unleashed the Zenith Martial Void Fist. The surrounding space distorted as the overwhelming chi exploded outward. The Blade God was engulfed by the deadly strike as the compressed chi shot forward like an arrow, dragging him violently across the terrain. The force carried him all the way to the frozen lake, where the ice shattered apart, filling the surroundings with a haze of freezing mist. Arc Wui stood there gasping for breath. He had exhausted every ounce of his strength. Then, from within the blinding torrent of chi, a lone silhouette slowly emerged. It advanced as though it were absorbing the very power surrounding it. In the next instant, razor-sharp streaks of chi swept across Arc Wui before carving straight through the mountains behind him. Arc Wui instinctively looked back in shock, unable to comprehend the terrifying surge of chi he had just sensed. Only then did he realize what had happened. The attack had been so unimaginably fast that he had failed to notice both of his arms had already been severed. An agonizing scream burst from his lips as blood poured uncontrollably from the wounds. Before Yowan had arrived, the Blade God had remarked that reaching such a martial realm through nothing but relentless training was truly remarkable. Even so, he had no time to continue playing with God of the East. There was someone he needed to meet. That person was the demon god, Chun Yowan. Now, the two finally stood face to face. Yowan silently examined the man before him. Something about him felt profoundly wrong. Inside, Yowan realized he could sense nothing from the Blade God. It was as though the man had become one with nature itself. There was no trace of emotion, no killing intent, not even the faintest ripple of feeling. It was not that his emotions were being concealed. They simply did not seem to exist. This was the very man who had fought both the Sword Demon and Jia Wung, the one who had traveled from the future. The tense silence lingered until the Blade God suddenly excused himself. Without waiting for a response, he stepped forward and lightly pressed a foot into the ground. The earth trembled violently. Within an instant, a crater nearly 3 feet wide formed beneath him. Yowan initially failed to understand what he was doing. Then he felt it. A familiar energy surged from beneath the ground. It was the power of the Void Fist. The Blade God calmly observed that he had attempted to disperse the lingering energy within his own body, but it had proven surprisingly troublesome. He admitted that he had never before encountered someone who had reached such a martial realm using nothing but fist techniques. Even after death, Arc Wui still remained standing in the same place like an unyielding tree. Aside from Yowan's ancestor, he had never seen another martial artist possess such unwavering pride, and he found that admirable. Yowan quietly considered those words. The Blade God spoke as though he had personally known the founding heavenly demon, yet something about him felt deeply unsettling. For the first time, Yowan felt genuine displeasure toward a martial artist he could acknowledge. The praise carried no warmth whatsoever. Not the slightest emotion accompanied it. Without emotion, those words sounded less like admiration and more like mockery. Yowan questioned whether the Blade God had begun speaking words he did not truly mean. The Blade God answered that it was unfortunate Yowan saw it that way, though he understood why. He explained that he had simply lived for far too long, and over that immense passage of time, his human emotions had gradually faded away. With those words, he turned toward the cloudy sky. Only then did Yowan notice something extraordinary. Rain fell naturally upon everything around them. It never touched the Blade God. Without any visible effort, every raindrop was gently repelled before reaching him. His internal energy flowed so naturally that it resembled breathing itself. The Blade God remarked that time was a truly strange thing. Just as rivers and mountains could transform over the course of 10 years, human emotions also gradually became dull. Yowan demanded to know what he was trying to say. The Blade God replied that their positions had become completely reversed, and that feeling was unfamiliar. Looking at the demon god while he still possessed human emotions felt strange. Long ago, Yowan had truly embodied the title of demon god. No, he had been something even greater, a perfect god. Yowan remarked that the Blade God spoke as though they had known one another for a very long time, even though this was their first meeting. The Blade God admitted that he had often wondered how it would feel to stand on equal ground with Yowan. Now he understood. To his own surprise, he found himself feeling no desire to fight. Then his expression darkened. He remarked that no one ever felt the urge to battle a fruit fly. At most, it was simply an annoyance. He was certain that Yo-won himself had once looked upon him in exactly the same way. The instant those words ended, the blade god vanished from where he had been standing. In the blink of an eye, he appeared directly before Yo-won. Yo-won's eyes widened. Inside, disbelief surged through him as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. The blade god had not used a qinggong technique. It was as though he had simply reduced the space between them. The blade god immediately launched a kick. Yo-won reacted at once, raising his left arm to intercept it. The impact exploded with overwhelming force. Despite blocking the strike, Yo-won was hurled backwards, skipping across the ground. The kick had appeared effortless, almost casual, yet it carried an incomprehensible weight. Even with the nano suit absorbing much of the impact, the destructive force still battered his arm, sending violent pain through his entire body. The blade god calmly closed the distance again. He remarked that Yo-won had done well, revealing that the kick had originally been intended to shatter his arm. Without pause, the blade god lifted his leg high before bringing it crashing down in a devastating axe kick aimed directly at Yo-won's head. Yo-won hastily crossed both arms, flooding them with internal energy. The crushing force descended. The ground beneath Yo-won's feet, already crushed beneath his ankles, continued collapsing deeper with every impact. Deep within, Yo-won realized that even with 10th Mastery Chi, he could barely block 70% of the force. Continuing to receive the attacks head-on was impossible. He had to begin deflecting them. The blade god increased the pressure beneath his foot. The earth beneath Yo-won exploded apart, sending shattered stone and debris flying in every direction. Blood trickled from the corner of Yo-won's mouth as the accumulated force inflicted internal injuries. The nanosuit absorbed as much of the punishment as it could, but visible cracks had begun spreading across its surface. Nano immediately reported that both of Yo-won's arms had been fractured before initiating self-recovery. The blade god's eyes narrowed. He found it remarkable that the armor had survived intact. Realizing it was no ordinary equipment, he questioned how Yo-won could possibly be wearing armor created with future technology. At that instant, an intense heat erupted from Yo-won's hand. The blade god showed genuine curiosity upon seeing the black flames. Simultaneously wielding two different forms of true chi was something he himself had never attempted. Black flame chi instantly condensed into multiple formless swords before streaking toward the blade god. He stopped every one of them with his bare hands. Yo-won was stunned. The blade god had blocked the formless sword without using any weapon at all. A faint smile crossed the blade god's face. Quietly, he acknowledged that combining the berserk saber techniques with the heavenly demon sword art had produced a technique even more impressive than he had anticipated. He remarked that he finally understood why the blade master had struggled so much against Yo-won and admitted that the technique was truly interesting. Yo-won frowned and coldly replied that the blade god should experience for himself whether it was truly interesting. The moment those words ended, the invisible black flame sword traced blazing arcs through the air. Its movement surged like an endless tidal wave, powerful enough to swallow the sun itself. In the blink of an eye, 24 blazing trajectories enveloped the blade god. Yo-won expected his opponent to answer with an invisible sword of his own. Instead, the blade god merely manipulated his internal energy with effortless precision. Using nothing more than that, he completely neutralized the incoming assault. As the black flames gradually dispersed into the air, the blade god calmly remarked that Yo-won had not disappointed him after all. For the first time in the battle, he had been forced to use both hands. Yo-won was left utterly bewildered. Internally, he could scarcely believe what he had witnessed. The blade god had countered the demon god sword art itself, using nothing but another blade technique performed entirely with his bare hands. The blade god's hand slowly moved. He calmly declared that it was now Yo-won's turn to try blocking his attack. The instant those words ended, an invisible sword sliced through the air. The sudden surge of energy made Yo-won's eyes narrow. Without hesitation, he poured even more internal energy into the invisible sword forged from black flame chi and raised it like a shield. The impact struck with terrifying force. Yo-won was driven backward, sliding more than 20 steps across the ground. As the pressure continued mounting, cracks spread across the invisible black flame sword that was shielding him. Inside, Yo-won realized it was over. The weapon could no longer withstand the blade god's overwhelming power. With a violent shatter, the invisible black flame sword finally broke apart. Freed from resistance, the blade god's invisible blade continued forward and carved carved directly into Yo-Won's body. A harsh metallic screech echoed across the plains as the nanosuit absorbed the slash. Nano immediately reported that the Getlinium nanosuit's durability had decreased by 9%. Yo-Won cried out in agony. Blood poured from his mouth as the devastating attack ravaged his body. Although the power of the essence cores and Nano's self-repair rapidly restored his torn internal organs, the Blade God's blade chi had already seeped deep into his body, and the lingering energy made the pain unbearable. Nano attempted to accelerate the recovery of his damaged organs. The process abruptly failed. A warning sounded as Nano reported that a formless energy was interfering with the restoration process. Yo-Won immediately realized that the Blade God's blade chi had to be expelled from his body before he could fully recover. Suppressing the pain, he focused all of his attention inward. The Blade God approached at an unhurried pace. He remarked that Yo-Won had already fought continuously throughout the day, making it nearly impossible to expel the invading blade chi with the amount of true chi he had left. Then he added that Yo-Won might not even possess enough true chi remaining to accomplish that anymore. Breathing heavily, Yo-Won realized that the Blade God had been watching everything from the very beginning. The Blade God calmly confirmed it. He explained that dividing an enemy's forces and weakening them before striking was simply the foundation of warfare, even if that enemy happened to be nothing more than a fruit fly. Yo-Won could not deny it. The Blade God was right. The Blade God then revealed that he had learned everything by watching Yo-Won. Yo-Won frowned in confusion. He reminded the Blade God that this was their very first meeting and demanded to know what he meant by claiming he had learned from him. The Blade God explained that he had never intended to meet Yo-Won there in the first place. Over the immense passage of time, every emotion he had once held toward Yo-Won had gradually disappeared. However, Yo-Won's strength had grown far more rapidly than the records had predicted, awakening his curiosity. Reflecting on it now, the Blade God concluded that it made perfect sense others had arrived at the same conclusion he had. His gaze settled upon the nanosuit. He remarked that he had been wondering why Yo-Won was wearing armor built with future technology. Now he understood. The demonic cult had also managed to reach the future. The moment the Blade God mentioned the nanosuit, Yo-Won's expression stiffened. Inside, he was astonished that the Blade God had deduced so much merely from Nano's existence. The Blade God found it peculiar. Yo-Won was equipped with technology from the future, yet those who had sent him apparently knew so little. Calling it disappointing, he remarked that if he were capable of hacking it, he would gladly steal it for himself. Declaring that enough had been said, he ended the conversation. The atmosphere around the Blade God abruptly changed. An unusual pressure spread through the surroundings as he calmly advanced toward Yo-Won. Cold sweat covered Yo-Won's face as he desperately tried to expel the invading blade chi from his body. Before he could finish, the Blade God moved like a shadow. In a single instant, he appeared directly behind him. The Blade God remarked that he should finish what had begun earlier. His hand shot forward and seized Fengbo's essence core, which was embedded within the nano suit. Pulling firmly on it, he attempted to tear the suit apart. At the same time, his trembling fingers condensed an invisible sword. Without hesitation, he swung it toward the metal surrounding the essence core. Then, an overwhelming surge of energy erupted from Yo-Won's body alongside scorching heat. An invisible sword burst into existence, unfolding the extreme art of the Blade God. The Blade God effortlessly blocked the incoming invisible sword. Yo-Won immediately took advantage of the brief opening. Maintaining a distance of exactly 4 steps, he launched one relentless attack after another. He coldly declared that it was once again the Blade God's turn to block his attack. In that instant, an invisible sword forged from black thunder. Although only a single sword had formed, the surrounding air trembled violently as every ounce of energy converged into it. The supreme technique, unification. A beam of black lightning erupted at point-blank range. Deep within, the Blade God recognized the phenomenon. It resembled the destruction of space employed by the combat divine. Yet this attack possessed even greater power. Yo-Won roared as he poured every remaining fragment of strength into the strike. Inside, he knew this battle could not continue any longer. No matter the cost, he had to kill the Blade God there and then, even if it meant exhausting every last drop of his remaining true chi. The Blade God extended a single hand and met the lightning head on. The surrounding air rippled violently around his palm. The technique resembled Ark Woi's method of defense. Only this was on an entirely different level. Blackened flesh spread across half of the blade god's palm as he was gradually forced backward. Then, unexpectedly, he withdrew the very hand that had been resisting the lightning. It was as though he had absorbed the attack itself. At the same moment, his other hand, held in the shape of an invisible sword, swept through the air. The lightning was redirected upward and launched into the sky. Yo-Won's eyes widened in shock. He had blocked it. The blade god had not emerged unharmed. Half of his right hand had melted away beneath the overwhelming force. Even so, he had still blocked the attack. Yo-Won's eyes trembled in disbelief. Nano's warning echoed through his mind. His remaining energy had fallen below 1%. Gritting his teeth, Yo-Won forced himself to remain standing. Inside, it felt as though every part of his body was screaming in agony. He had consumed far too much true chi. The blade god lowered his gaze to his right hand, where nearly half of it had been blown away. Deep within, he realized the wound was not regenerating. The dark energy lingering within the damaged flesh was preventing the restoration from taking place. Watching the phenomenon with interest, he forced the dark energy out. The black energy seeped away, and the melted remains of his hand regenerated almost instantly. Acknowledging Yo-Won's strength, the blade god judged him to have surpassed even the god of the East, admitting that the battle had demanded far more effort than he had anticipated. Even so, he declared that everything would end there. He casually traced a line through the air with his hand. A terrifying surge of invisible power pierced straight through Yo-Won's body. Blood burst from Yo-Won's mouth as though he had been impaled by sheer will alone. Agonizing pain clamped around his heart, making his entire body convulse before his exhausted legs finally gave way. Unable to endure any longer, he collapsed forward. Closing the distance without haste, the blade god declared that the force lodged within Yo-Won's body could never be expelled, adding that Yo-Won had already exhausted all of his true chi. Yo-Won trembled violently. Inside, disbelief overwhelmed him as he tried to comprehend what had pierced him. The chilling sensation resembled death itself. It did not feel like an ordinary chi technique. Instead, it felt as though it had sliced through his very will. With a light wave of the blade god's hand, invisible energy tore open the section of the white tiger suit that secured its core. The core slipped free and rolled across the ground. The blade god remarked that the infamous demon god was about to die while trembling in pain and fear. For the first time, his lips curved into a smile as he admitted that he had not experienced such joy in a very long time. A series of coughs suddenly echoed from behind him. The blade god turned in surprise. To his astonishment, the one coughing was Ark Woi. Despite having both arms severed and his head hanging low, Ark Woi remained standing, his unwavering gaze fixed upon the blade god. Darkness completely surrounded Ark Woi. Pondering his condition, he realized he could no longer move and accepted that this was death. He expected that what came next would soon appear before him. Instead, a familiar voice broke through the darkness, remarking with disbelief that it had never seen him in such a pitiful state. The voice mocked him for surrendering, even though the bastard who had killed them all was still alive. The voices belonged to Feng Bo and his old companion, Sakyung. Sakyung reminded him that he had been entrusted with carrying their hatred and admitted that he would be disappointed if Ark Woi abandoned that burden. Recognizing them, Ark Woi wondered if they had come to welcome him in death. Feng Bo told him that the time had not yet come, insisting that there was still something he had to do. Confused, Ark Woi questioned what remained. Feng Bo answered that Ark Woi still needed to make that damn murderer pay on behalf of all of them. Ark Woi hesitated, reminding them that both of his arms had already been severed. Feng Bo questioned whether he had already forgotten something truly important. Outside that vision, Ark Woi took another step. The blade god frowned as he watched him advance. He expressed genuine surprise that a man he had expected to die was still moving and questioned what force was driving him forward. Ark Woi offered no reply. He simply continued panting as he forced himself to take yet another step. The blade god questioned whether Ark Woi had forgotten that both of his arms had already been severed. To him, the battle had long since ended, and he dismissed the value of sheer determination, believing that will alone could accomplish nothing. Ark Woi forced himself to take another step. Every breath came with immense effort as he declared that his friends had entrusted him with carrying their burden, and that he still had to fulfill that duty. It felt as though the spirits of his fallen companions were standing behind him, lending him their strength. A deafening roar escaped his lips. Blood burst from his mouth as his shoulders trembled violently, yet he staggered another step forward. Though both of his arms were gone, his movements resembled a man still throwing punches with everything he had. Unable to understand a word Ark Wui was saying, the Blade God declared that he intended to send him to the same place as the others. Before he could finish speaking, an invisible fist forged from true chi surged toward him. The impact struck his chest with the force of an exploding shell. His body was violently hurled backward before grinding to a screeching halt. He dropped to one knee, unable to remain standing against the overwhelming force. The Blade God steadied himself in disbelief, finding it absurd that he had been forced onto one knee. Recognizing the technique, he identified it as the Mind Fist. Drawing slow, labored breaths, Ark Wui affirmed the truth of it. He declared that the loss of his arms no longer mattered because a man's true strength lay in his will. The ultimate fist was one engraved into the soul itself, forged through more than 100 years of relentless training beneath both rain and snow. A faint smile spread across Ark Wui's lips as the rain washed the blood from his face. Filled with gratitude, he thanked his friends, believing that, for one final time in his life, he had been able to throw the greatest punch he possibly could. With that final thought, his soul departed from his body and reunited with his companions in heaven. The Blade God's face twisted with fury. Enraged that Ark Wui had died wearing such a satisfied expression, he could scarcely contain his anger. A violent throb pulsed through his chest. Blood spilled from his mouth as an unbearable force tightened around his heart. Rage consumed him. He could not tolerate that Ark Wui had managed to inflict such a blow upon him. The Mind Fist was a technique similar in nature to the attack the Blade God had used against Chunyo-1, as both targeted an opponent's will. However, the true terror of the Mind Fist lay elsewhere. Beyond shattering one's will, it also destroyed the body itself. Coughing up blood once more, the Blade God fumed over the humiliation of suffering such an ultimate technique from someone who was neither the heavenly demon nor the demon god. Realizing he had no alternative, he resolved to purge the lingering Mind Fist energy before anything else. Yet the will embedded within the attack was so powerful that it resisted expulsion. Using the energy of great nature would take far too long, leaving him with only one option: to draw upon the spiritual chi contained within his essence core. With that decision made, he picked up the core. The moment it rested in his hand, his expression stiffened. The essence core, which should have been overflowing with spiritual chi, was completely empty. His eyes immediately shifted toward the collapsed Yo-1. Deep down, he rejected the possibility. There should not have been enough time for Yo-1 to absorb the core's energy. The situation defied all reason. Determined to confirm it himself, the Blade God endured the relentless pain crushing his heart and walked toward Yo-1's fallen body. The Blade God dismissed the possibility that Yo-1 could have absorbed the essence core during their battle. Internally, he reminded himself that he had already confirmed Yo-1 had exhausted every trace of his true chi. Even so, Yo-1 was the demon god, and that alone compelled him to verify it one last time. As the Blade God's footsteps drew closer, anxiety quietly stirred beneath Yo-1's tightly closed eyes. Within his mind, he asked NANO for an update. NANO reported that the analysis had reached 98%. When the Blade God stood only 2 steps away, NANO's voice echoed through Yo-1's consciousness once more. The analysis of the energy stored within the Gatelinium had been completed, and the system began converting the accumulated energy into Yo-1's own. Before the duel with the Blade God had even begun, Yo-1 had prepared himself for every possible outcome. Regardless of his opponent's abilities, he had no way of knowing whether the Blade God possessed power equal to the Blade Lord. For that reason, he had asked NANO whether it could absorb the spiritual chi contained within the essence core into the nanosuit, just as it had previously absorbed the Dragon Turtle's lightning. NANO had confirmed that it was possible, explaining that Gatelinium possessed a structure ideally suited for both energy absorption and shock absorption. Yo-1 had then asked whether the energy could be analyzed during the absorption process. NANO confirmed that it could. Without hesitation, Yo-1 ordered the process to begin. NANO immediately initiated the absorption of the essence core's energy into the nano suit. Yo-1's judgment proved correct. The instant the Blade God closed the distance to a single step, the nano suit suddenly erupted with dazzling light. Its radiance mirrored the glow once emitted by the White Tiger's essence core. For the first time, the Blade God's usually composed eyes wavered with unmistakable shock. At the same moment, Yo-Won slipped away from the Blade God's reach before coming to a stop several paces away. NANO announced that it had begun converting the Essence Core's energy into Yo-Won's own, with the process reaching 3%. The Blade God immediately sensed spiritual chi emanating from the NANO suit and realized that it had absorbed the Essence Core's power. Deep within, disbelief seized him. Even the 10 millennia frost metal was incapable of absorbing spiritual chi, yet that suit had accomplished exactly that. The only explanation he could conceive was that the suit originated from a future even more advanced than the one from which he himself had come. Rejecting the possibility of allowing the demon god to absorb the Wind White Tiger's essence core as well, he resolved that immortality would belong to him alone. Drawing a deep breath, he refused to allow Yo-Won to complete the absorption. The air around the Blade God rippled as a sword materialized in his right hand. In response, Yo-Won summoned a sword forged from black flames and aimed it directly at him. The Blade God immediately realized that Yo-Won had already recovered a considerable amount of true chi. He charged head-on into the incoming strike and cleaved through the black flaming sword with his own chi, declaring that such an attack would never be enough. Watching the exchange, Yo-Won cursed inwardly. The Blade God had destroyed the formless sword far too easily. He had expected the technique to last longer because of the Blade God's injuries, but the overwhelming difference in strength between them remained far too great. A violent throb surged through Yo-Won's chest. His breathing became ragged as he staggered unsteadily. The blade chi embedded within him continued to assault his heart without pause. Struggling for breath, Yo-Won realized that the relentless blade chi attacking his heart remained the greatest obstacle. Although the spiritual chi flowing from the nano suit had restored a portion of his strength, he still could not fight properly. He knew he first had to expel the lingering energy. Before he could act, the Blade God appeared before him in an instant, moving as though space itself obeyed his will. Yo-Won immediately unleashed a blade of black flames toward the Blade God's neck. The Blade God tilted slightly to his left, evading the strike with minimal movement before seizing Yo-Won's right arm. An overwhelming force flooded through the Blade God's grip, making Yo-Won feel as though his wrist would be crushed at any moment. The Blade God dismissed the idea that merely absorbing spiritual chi could ever be enough to defeat him. Abandoning any attempt to save his trapped wrist, Yo-Won instantly forged another sword in his remaining hand. The Blade God calmly raised his free hand, and invisible energy flashed. In the next instant, Yo-Won's left arm was severed. Blood erupted from the wound as an agonized scream escaped him. Looking upon Yo-Won's condition, the Blade God smiled, likening the difference between them to that of humans and flies. Before he could continue, a violent pulse struck his own body. Blood spilled from the Blade God's mouth. Deep down, irritation welled within him. The God of the East's attack was still tormenting him, and unless he removed the lingering energy, it would continue to hinder him. A new plan immediately formed in his mind. He would use Yo-Won's spiritual chi to eliminate the remaining energy while simultaneously preventing the demon god from fully absorbing the essence core. By destroying the nanosuit and claiming its power for himself, he could accomplish both objectives at once. His sword descended toward the nano suit's core. In that fleeting instant, the Blade God met Yo-Won's eyes. An ominous sensation washed over him. Within his mind, Yo-Won gave Nano the order. Nano immediately released 5% of the stored energy as a concentrated wave. A brilliant radiance exploded from the nano suit, expanding outward in the form of a perfect sphere. The swelling energy burst outward to a radius of 5 meters. Caught in the blast, the Blade God was violently hurled away. His body bounced repeatedly across the battlefield as he struggled to regain his balance. For a brief moment, his concentration faltered. The pain gripping his heart returned with even greater intensity. Clutching his chest, he coughed up another mouthful of blood. Then everything changed. The immense energy surrounding him erupted into chaos. Invisible swords began taking shape around him, one forged from black flames, another from black lightning, and a third from black ice. The Blade God's eyes widened in disbelief. 3 entirely different energies had manifested simultaneously, something he could scarcely believe possible. Even through the unbearable agony tearing at his heart, Yo-Won forced his fingers into position and created another energy sword. Inside, he steeled himself with the determination that this opportunity could not be wasted. Blood poured from his mouth as he screamed, pouring every remaining ounce of strength into a single command for the Blade God to die. At that very moment, ripples spread from the tips of all 3 invisible swords. The 3 weapons tore through the air simultaneously, racing toward the Blade God from different directions. Still clutching his chest, the Blade God's expression twisted as the three invisible swords closed in. He understood that if he failed to stop them, they would strike him head on. Though he possessed immortality, for the first time, he felt that his life itself was in genuine danger. Deep within, he realized that the attack had forced him to resort to that technique. Ignoring the unbearable pain tearing through his body, the Blade God stretched both arms to either side. With each hand, he traced a unique blade trajectory through the air. The Blade God roared the title of the demon god in defiance. The moment those words left his lips, the veil he had created shattered completely. Freed from its restraint, the three invisible swords converged upon the Blade God at the center. Black flames, black lightning, and black ice collided at a single point. The torrential rain stopped for an instant as an enormous explosion engulfed the battlefield. The shockwave reached all the way to Yo-Won, hurling him backward through the aftermath. His damaged heart screamed in agony as he crashed onto the ground. Even as excruciating pain consumed him, Yo-Won refused to close his eyes. He had to witness the Blade God's death with his own eyes. Through his blurred vision, the first thing he saw was an enormous crater where the entire lake had once existed. Dust continued to billow into the sky as the rain resumed with even greater intensity. When the dust finally cleared, half of the Blade God's upper body had been completely obliterated. The Blade God repeatedly coughed up blood before lifting bloodshot, fury-filled eyes toward the distant Yo-Won. His enraged roar echoed across the devastated battlefield as he called out to the demon god. Yo-Won froze in disbelief. Inside, he questioned whether the Blade God truly was an immortal being. Yet the Blade God faced a critical problem. The vicious dark energy lingering within his body continued to prevent his regeneration. Although he had absorbed the essence cores of the 5 spirit beasts and attained immortality, the corrupt energy refused to let his body recover. He knew he had to remove it. Had he remained in his original condition, he might have succeeded. Instead, another violent pulse struck his heart. The Mind Fist still ravaged him from within. Filled with resentment, the Blade God cursed the god of the East, realizing that the lingering Mind Fist continued to obstruct him even at this very moment. Groaning through the pain, Yo-Won formed another invisible blade. NANO immediately warned him that any further expenditure of energy would be dangerous. Yo-Won ignored the warning. To him, none of it mattered anymore. As long as the attack pierced the Blade God's heart, it would be enough. With that resolve, he unleashed the Black Flame Sword Chi. At that very instant, a handsome young man with bright red hair appeared before the Blade God and intercepted the strike. The sight left Yo-Won drained and stunned. Inside, frustration overwhelmed him as he cursed his misfortune. The newcomer, Gul-Wan, immediately addressed the Blade God with concern, asking whether his lord was safe. Recognizing him, the Blade God weakly uttered Gul-Wan's name. Gul-Wan stared at the Blade God's condition in utter shock. Deep within, disbelief consumed him. He had been certain that the Blade God would defeat the demon god effortlessly. Instead, not only had his lord been driven to such a state, but his body had also failed to regenerate. His attention remained fixed on the sinister black energy lingering within the wounds as he struggled to understand what it truly was. Without hesitation, Gul-Wan rushed to support him, offering to help drive the black energy from his body. The Blade God weakly refused. Instead, he insisted that Gul-Wan kill the demon god at once. They had to eliminate him immediately. Gul-Wan hesitated, warning that if the Blade God did not recover first, the situation could become truly dangerous. The Blade God erupted in fury, ordering him to do it without delay. Gul-Wan studied the devastated battlefield. Inside, he realized that the demon god had somehow pushed his lord to the very limit despite the overwhelming difference in their martial prowess. If that was truly the case, then the demon god had to die there without fail. Accepting the command, Gul-Wan vowed to carry it out. After carefully laying the Blade God on the ground, he stepped forward. He remarked that it had been a very long time since he had last used that power. The moment those words left him, blazing red flames engulfed his entire body. Filled with exhilaration, Gul-Wan declared that just as the Blade God had commanded, the demon god would die where he stood. Yo-Won's vision blurred as he blinked repeatedly. Deep down, he realized his body refused to respond. He wondered if this truly marked the end. At that very moment, a colossal wall of ice erupted before him, stretching across the plains. An instant later, Gul-Wan's blazing flames crashed into the wall of ice. Steam exploded into the air where fire and ice collided. Startled, Gul-Wan watched as a silver-haired, middle-aged man stepped in front of him. For a brief moment, the two overwhelming techniques clashed head-on. Neither overpowered the other, and both men were forced backward. Interrupted, Gulwan fixed a sharp glare upon the newcomer and demanded to know his identity. The silver-haired man declared himself to be the great elder of the heavenly demon divine cult. A glimmer flashed across Gulwan's eyes. Inside, curiosity stirred. It was the first time he had ever heard of such a figure within the demonic cult. Frowning, Gulwan unleashed volley after volley of flame chi while acknowledging the great elder's strength. Nevertheless, he declared that he had no time to waste fighting him. Dan Juchin swung his ice-cold staff, dispersing the incoming flames. The violent collision produced a surge of steam that forced him to stagger backward. Seizing that opening, Gulwan rushed past him, determined to finish the demon god himself. He declared that it would all end there. Before he could reach Yo-Won, countless sword flashes suddenly erupted before him. The sword moved with blinding speed, leaving him astonished by the sheer nature of the assault. At last, one slash pierced through the surrounding flames and grazed his cheek. Forced to retreat once again, Gulwan failed to reach Yo-Won. He recognized the newcomer immediately. It was the Dark King, Markham, the great guardian of the demonic cult. As expected, more figures emerged from the mountain behind Yo-Won. They were the Six Swords. Munku and Hobum hurried forward, catching Yo-Won before he could collapse completely. They anxiously asked about his condition, but Yo-Won could not utter a single word. The relentless pain left him capable of nothing more than strained breaths. The moment Munku noticed his severed left arm, despair overwhelmed her. Hobum quickly reminded her that the cult leader had already consumed the essence cores of the Fire Kirin and the Dragon Turtle. Watching the situation unfold, Gulwan silently assessed the battlefield. Had only the Great Elder arrived, he believed he could have managed the situation somehow. But now that the demonic cult's strongest fighters had all gathered, even he would be placed in grave danger. Though unwilling, he concluded that retreat was the only option. Just then, his eyes caught someone rushing toward the Blade God at tremendous speed. It was Chun-Inji, the former lord. Inside, Chun-Inji acknowledged that anyone who remained alive after losing nearly a quarter of their body could no longer be considered human. If that monster had reduced Yo-Won to such a condition, then he posed an unimaginable threat. With the Blade God unable to move, Chun-Inji realized this was their only chance to eliminate him with a single strike. Realizing what was about to happen, Gulwan desperately tried to intervene. He was too late. Chun-Inji had already reached the Blade God and prepared to unleash the sword force of the Sky Demon. Just before the technique could be released, Hwang Heol snatched the Blade God away. Recognizing Hwang Heol, Gulwan let out a quiet breath of relief. At once, Mong Mu and Wang Hul charged after them, determined to prevent their escape. Before they could close the distance, Gulwan unleashed a towering wall of fire that cut them off and halted the pursuit. Wang Hul grimaced as the blazing flames blocked his path. Watching the escape unfold, Gulwan acknowledged that his timing had been perfect. Had he arrived even a moment later, the Blade God would have been placed in mortal danger. Before departing, Gulwan warned the demonic cult that the matter was far from over. With those words, he rushed toward the Blade God. His speed was so overwhelming that his figure rapidly shrank into a distant speck before disappearing from sight. Markham and Dan Jushin immediately pursued them. Meanwhile, Munku's anguished scream echoed across Changbai Mountain. Hearing her cry, every member of the demonic cult rushed toward her in alarm, demanding to know what had happened. Sobbing uncontrollably, Munku struggled to speak. She finally revealed that the cult leader was no longer breathing. Yo-Won's eyes remained open, but the light within them had vanished, and his body lay completely limp. Chun-Inji and the others immediately rushed to his side, refusing to believe what they had heard. Hobum stared in disbelief, insisting that such words should never be spoken. Through trembling sobs, Munku explained that the light surrounding Yo-Won's body had disappeared. The strength had left his hand, and he had stopped breathing. Chun-Inji knelt beside Yo-Won's motionless body and placed his fingers against him to confirm it for himself. The instant he checked, his aged face stiffened. Overwhelmed by what he had felt, he staggered backward before collapsing in shock. Ko Wang-Hul hurried to support him, but Chun-Inji quietly refused. With immense difficulty, he admitted that Yo-Won was no longer breathing. Never had he imagined that such a tragedy would unfold on Changbai Mountain, the very place to which he himself had summoned Yo-Won. Baekji desperately rejected the reality before him, refusing to believe that Yo-Won could die so easily. Hobum clung to the same hope, insisting insisting that the cult leader was merely gravely injured and nothing more. Unable to surrender, Munku gathered her energy and tried to transfer it into Yo-Won's body. Chun-Inji stopped her. He quietly told her to stop denying the reality before their eyes. With Yo-Won's breathing completely gone, injecting internal energy into his body would only inflict further damage. Hot tears streamed down Munku's cheeks. Still sobbing, she gently caressed Yo-Won's cheek, only to find that the warmth she had always known was gone. Overcome with grief, she lamented that if he truly left her like this, she did not know what would become of her. Before she could finish speaking, an overwhelming change erupted. A brilliant light suddenly began radiating from within Yo-Won's body. His entire body slowly rose into the air. Startled, everyone instinctively retreated. None of them could comprehend what they were witnessing as the countless energies within Yo-Won began to stir. The powers of flame, ice, thunder, wind, and the ominous heavenly demon Chi all surged outward simultaneously. The 5 distinct energies emerged from Yo-Won's body and began resonating with one another. Watching the unbelievable phenomenon, Chun-Inji murmured in astonishment that they were the energies of the 5 spirit cores. The blazing power of the flame Kirin, representing the center, manifested first. To Yo-Won's right appeared the energy of the white tiger, symbolizing the east. To his left rose the power taken from the great bird, representing the west. Above him hovered the energy of the dragon turtle, symbolizing the north. Yet one energy stood apart from all the others. Inside, Chun-Inji questioned the identity of the eerie black power before him. Then realization struck him. A joyful laugh escaped his lips as he declared that he had known Yo-Won would never die so easily. Instead, he concluded that Yo-Won was on the verge of undergoing a metamorphosis. Hobum stared in shock as the sinister black energy began absorbing the powers of the 5 sacred beings. Deep in thought, Chun-Inji wondered whether that black power was the heavenly demon Chi itself. The final member of the 5 sacred beings should have been the earth dragon Imugi, yet the heavenly demon Chi appeared to be acting as its substitute. Even so, he sensed that it was still unable to achieve perfect balance with the other 4 energies. Recognizing the danger of interfering, Mongmu immediately ordered everyone to move away from the demon lord and not interrupt his transformation. Even he could not hide his confusion as he questioned what exactly was happening to the supreme heavenly demon. Chun-Inji admitted that he did not know the answer either. All they could do now was pray that Yo-Won would survive the transformation safely. Yo-Won, whose heart stood on the verge of destruction from the blade energy, underwent drastic changes. As unbearable pain consumed him, he became acutely aware of the transformation unfolding within. Deep within, he sensed a vast current of great chi unlike anything he had ever experienced. Though he could neither see, touch, nor smell it, he knew of its existence with absolute certainty. At the same time, an overwhelming rhythm echoed through his awareness. He first questioned where the sound was coming from, before realizing that was the wrong question altogether. It was a pulse he could hear from every living being, the heartbeat of all life within the realm itself. He could feel the energy of all things and perceive the immense flow that connected every existence. That understanding did not end there. He also perceived the spiritual energy of the core moving in perfect harmony with that great current, following the very order of Mother Nature. In that instant, he realized that all energies flowed through an endless cycle before harmonizing, and that his own chi had always been a part of Mother Nature. The revelation shattered everything he had believed about chi. It was never something confined within the body. If it moved with the great flow, it could become one with every existence in the world. As that realization settled within him, even greater changes overtook his body. His bones and muscles seemed on the verge of being reconstructed, as though he were undergoing physical reconstruction itself. Yet what was taking place was fundamentally different. The energies of the 5 spirit beasts surrounding him began to harmonize, but the balance was not the perfect equilibrium he had envisioned. The demon energy steadily eroded the harmony created by the other 4 energies, devouring them like prey as though it stood above them as their natural predator. His heart, already enduring relentless changes, pounded even more violently. Although the Blade God's blade energy remained embedded within him, its movement gradually weakened. Within himself, he refused to let the opportunity slip away. Focusing every one of his senses on his heart, he concentrated solely on reducing the invisible blade energy to nothing. His resolve blazed fiercely as he rejected its presence, declaring that his heart and body would contain only the energies he accepted of his own will. The instant that unwavering determination ignited, the blade energy eroding Chun Yo-won's heart could no longer withstand the surging forces within him. It was violently forced out of his body. A razor-sharp burst of energy erupted from the black sphere surrounding him. The cultists stared in stunned disbelief at the unprecedented sight. They had clearly witnessed a sharp blade energy shooting out, and at that very moment, everyone sensed its presence. The energy released by the Demon Lord had split the sky itself. Choninji was astonished. Although he had not seen it directly, he was certain that the energy had been blade chi. He realized that such power had been inside Yo-won's body the entire time, leaving him unable to comprehend who could have survived in such a state while even wielding blade chi, a power completely different from the formless blade. It was then that the black sphere surrounding Yo-won began to tremble. The massive sphere gradually shrank, drawing everyone's attention. Before long, it outlined the shape of a human figure before completely collapsing into Yo-won's body. None of those watching understood what had happened, but the sight of Chun Yo-won standing there with his eyes closed had become profoundly different. Looking at him was like gazing into endless darkness itself. An overwhelming sensation gripped the onlookers as they felt as though they were staring into an infinite void. At that very moment, the arm guard on Yo-won's right arm disassembled piece by piece before transforming into a sword. It was the Heavenly Demon Sword. The instant the cultists witnessed the sacred weapon reveal its true form, they immediately dropped to their knees on the rain-soaked ground and bowed their heads. Choninji was left trying to comprehend the incomprehensible, wondering whether everything taking place was somehow connected to Yo-won's Heavenly Demon Chi. Then, without anyone touching it, the Heavenly Demon Sword moved on its own and flew into Yo-won's hand. In the next instant, Yo-won found himself within a world consumed by absolute darkness. There was nothing to sense, not even the great flow of Mother Nature's energy. It was a space that resembled a boundless void. He had experienced this place twice before. The first time was when he obtained the Heavenly Demon's Sword, and the second was when he held the ice-cold staff. During those encounters, he had merely been an observer within the darkness. This time was different. Although his physical body was absent, his consciousness truly felt as though it existed within the empty realm. He could not understand the meaning behind the phenomenon. He immediately called out to NANO, but no response came. It seemed he had been completely isolated. Deep within, he realized that the moment he fully comprehended the principles of great nature, the energies of the mythical creatures had been overtaken by the Heavenly Demon Chi, drawing him back into this mind realm. A voice suddenly echoed through the endless darkness. Without realizing it, Yo-won found a man standing directly before him. The sudden appearance left him momentarily speechless. The man repeated himself, calmly expressing that he had expected no less from his own descendant. Inside, Yo-won recalled seeing this very figure within the mind realm through the Heavenly Demon Sword before. From the man, he could sense an immeasurable demonic aura accompanied by the overwhelming dignity of a supreme leader. Unsure, he wondered if those words had truly been directed at him. The man scoffed at his hesitation, pointing out that there was no one else present. Realization struck Yo-won, and he asked if the man before him was the founding Heavenly Demon. The man confirmed his deduction with an approving remark that he was not as foolish as he appeared. The figure standing before him was Chun Ma, the ruler and founder of the Heavenly Demon Divine Cult. Without the slightest hesitation, Yo-won dropped to one knee and respectfully introduced himself as Chun Yo-won, the 24th leader of the Heavenly Demon Divine Cult, offering his deepest greetings to the great founding Heavenly Demon. Chun Ma told Yo-won there was no need for such formality. He explained that he was merely a fragment containing the will of the being Yo-won believed him to be, the very essence of his will that had been imbued into the Heavenly Demon's Sword. Deep within, Yo-won understood those words immediately. In the past, he would never have grasped their meaning, but after attaining enlightenment regarding great nature and experiencing both the Mind Blade and the Mind Fist, their significance had become perfectly clear. Chun Ma acknowledged Yo-won's understanding and remarked that it was precisely why he had returned. He admitted that he had expected Yo-won to take much longer before reaching this realm of nothingness again, making his swift return all the more impressive. Yo-won humbly replied that Chun Ma was giving him too much credit. Chun Ma dismissed his modesty, stating that only someone with extraordinary talent could have completely embraced the demonic aura and completed the demonic path. The unfamiliar term left Yo-won confused. Seeing his reaction, Chun-ma smiled before asking if he truly had remained unaware despite accomplishing all of that. As Yo-won remained puzzled, Chun-ma explained that the wrath and resentment of a dragon that had failed to ascend to the heavens had pierced the heavens and taken on the energy of a demon instead. That fallen power had become the very foundation of the demonic path. Within himself, Yo-won pieced everything together. The heavenly demon chi had never been merely a dark energy. It was the spiritual chi of a fallen mythical creature. That realization explained why he had sensed a similar energy from the wind-white tiger. Then another thought crossed his mind. The essence core he had obtained from the wind-white tiger had remained in its original state, raising the possibility that the beast had possessed two essence cores for some unknown reason. He quickly cast that speculation aside as something far less important than the truth before him. If the demonic path had truly been built upon the energy of a fallen mythical creature, then it meant Chun-ma had deliberately corrupted the Amugi rather than sealing it away. Chun-ma confirmed that conclusion without hesitation. Although he admitted it was unfortunate for the dragon, he stated that he had no other choice. He added that they would discuss the matter later, as there was much he needed to tell Yo-won and very little time remained. Reaching into the empty void, Chun-ma effortlessly created a stone chair. Then, with another motion to his side, he formed the figure of a man. He explained that he had witnessed Yo-won's battle against that very person. The sight made Yo-won flinch as he immediately recognized the Blade God. Surprised, he admitted that he had never realized Chun-ma had been observing everything from within the heavenly demon's sword. Chun-ma told him there was no reason to feel embarrassed, praising him instead for reaching logical conclusions despite the overwhelming disparity in their levels of martial skill. Yo-won then asked whether Chun-ma had fought the Blade God as well, wondering if the traces left within the abandoned Sword Valley had been the result of that battle. The name momentarily puzzled Chun-ma until Yo-won explained that it was the place where he had carved the single word sword into a cliff with his blade. Understanding immediately, Chun-ma confirmed that they indeed had fought there. He explained that the Blade God had wielded a completely unfamiliar style of martial arts, unlike anything he had ever encountered. However, despite the uniqueness of those techniques, the Blade God's overall martial skill at the time had not been particularly remarkable, as he had only just begun to comprehend the concept of chi. Yo-won accepted those words without question, even though Chun-ma spoke of the Blade God as though he had been little more than a child. After all, the being standing before him was the legendary founder who had reached the mystic realm at the age of 18, surpassed every martial artist who had once been regarded as the strongest in Murim, and earned the title of the most powerful and invincible existence in the entire martial world. Chun-ma reflected that he had believed the Blade God had died after his sword pierced his head, yet the man had returned, incomparably stronger than he had been in the past. Yo-won remarked that such a transformation was possible if the Blade God had already possessed the essence core back then. Chun-ma agreed with that conclusion, stating that if so, the Blade God had to be the very individual spoken of in the prophecy. Yo-won asked Chun-ma what he meant by the prophecy. Chun-ma explained that long ago, a prophet had come to him with a prophecy concerning the divine cult. The prophet foretold that, in the distant future, the divine cult would face a great calamity, and that an immortal would bring the entirety of Murim to ruin. At first, Chun-ma had doubted the prophecy because of the mention of an immortal. Regardless of how high a martial artist's realm became, a human lifespan remained finite. If immortality truly existed, then it had to be the result of some extraordinary method. Driven by that belief, he searched countless ancient texts concerning the 5 sacred beings, and eventually concluded that anyone who absorbed the spiritual chi of all 5 would attain immortality. From that realization, he devised 3 countermeasures. The first was to prevent anyone from ever obtaining the essence cores of the 5 sacred beings. However, whenever one sacred creature disappeared, another eventually emerged, making the method far too inefficient. The second was for either himself or one of his successors to attain immortality first, allowing the divine cult to stand on equal footing with the immortal enemy destined to appear in the future. Startled, Yo-won realized that such a path could have made Chun-ma even stronger, and asked why he had never pursued it himself. Chun-ma laughed before explaining that the answer was simple. He could not remain the leader of the divine cult forever. Moreover, during his own era, no one could rival him, leaving him with no reason to wait endlessly for an enemy who might only appear in the distant future. Yo-won nodded in understanding before mentioning that the historical records of the heavenly demon divine cult stated that Chun-ma had ultimately achieved Tao through martial arts and ascended to immortality. Chunma reacted with amused surprise, remarking that if the records claimed so, then that was fine. Regardless, he had already decided that the second method should be left to a future successor. He was certain that capturing and imprisoning a mythical creature within the divine cult would have caused severe internal conflict, so he chose another path instead. He admitted that devising it had also been an enjoyable challenge. Yo-won asked whether that alternative was connected to the heavenly demon Chi. Chunma confirmed that it was. His objective had been to kill the immortal itself and prove that no immortality was truly absolute. He reasoned that if mythical creatures could be stripped of their ability to regenerate, then they too could be slain. Initially, he approached the problem through martial arts alone, but after studying Buddhist and Taoist teachings, he discovered that mythical creatures were born from the divine spiritual power that existed between heaven and earth. To oppose such spiritual power, one needed its complete opposite. Yo-won immediately realized that the answer was demonic chi. Pleased by his understanding, Chunma affirmed that this realization had marked the true beginning of the demonic path. Although the members of the heavenly demon divine cult worshipped the heavenly demon and the demon god, and were therefore known as demonic martial artists, they had never sought evil for its own sake. They simply revered martial arts above all else and believed in the principle of natural selection. Reflecting on everything he had learned, Yo-won realized that while this was how the divine cult's teachings had been passed down through history, it had not necessarily reflected Chunma's original intentions. Chunma explained that resentment and anger could give rise to murderous intent, but they alone could never lead one to the pure demonic path. That was why he had prevented the mythical creature from ascending and transformed its spiritual power into resentment, rage, and the desire for destruction. Although Yo-won had inherited the Amugi's spiritual chi by carrying on his will, an incomplete demonic path could never destroy an immortal. Quietly, Yo-won acknowledged that he had witnessed that truth for himself. Chunma told him not to be discouraged. Now that the demonic path had been completed, Yo-won possessed the power to annihilate everything in existence. As those words faded, Chunma casually flicked a finger. A sword materialized in midair. It was the heavenly demon sword. Grasping the hilt, Chunma declared that the true lesson would begin now. Since Yo-won had proven himself worthy, he would finally teach him the proper way to wield the heavenly demon chi. Surprised, Yo-won questioned whether the methods he had relied upon until now had been incorrect. Chunma explained that everything Yo-won had used so far amounted to only a tiny fraction of the heavenly demon chi's true power. Those who attained enlightenment through great nature could achieve sword-body unity and imbue a sword with their very will. Deep within, Yo-won immediately connected those words to the sword imbued with will that both the Blade God and the God of the East had demonstrated before him. Chunma declared that Yo-won would soon forget both the Mind Blade and Blade Body unity he had witnessed, for he was about to learn the greatest sword art in existence, a technique that no one but him could ever master. Eager to know its name, Yo-won asked what it was. Chunma revealed that it was the sword art capable of completely annihilating the world. It was the transient heavenly demon sword art. Chunma demonstrated the technique only a few times, yet Yo-won adapted to it with astonishing speed. Even within his spiritual form, a thrill ran down his spine as he grasped its profound principles. Chunma was unsurprised by Yo-won's talent. Despite demonstrating the technique only twice, Yo-won had already mastered it. The black heavenly demon sword in Yo-won's hand trembled faintly as an enormous crack spread across the realm of nothingness. Yo-won looked at his trembling right arm in confusion. Although they were within the mind realm, the violent shock still coursed through him, leaving him unable to understand how he could feel such a sensation without a physical body. Chunma explained that even outside the physical realm, the body still perceived the burden of the technique. Only someone possessing both an unshakable will and an exceptionally powerful body could wield it. Deep within, Yo-won was filled with awe. The demon god sword art he had once completed alongside NANO by combining the heavenly demon sword art and the berserk saber divine martial arts had only been possible because he had learned from the sword traces left behind by the founding heavenly demon. To him, Chunma truly stood as a god among martial artists. Just then, the realm of nothingness began to tremble. Although it had been an empty void, the entire space shook violently as though influenced by an unseen force. Alarmed, Yo-won wondered if he had struck with too much power. Chunma smiled and assured him that the disturbance had nothing to do with his attack. Their time had simply come to an end. Chuckling softly, he told Yo-won not to be disappointed, explaining that the strength contained within this fragment of his original self had finally been exhausted. Although their meeting had felt shorter than the last, he assumed that an immense amount of time had passed since then. Even so, it had been enough. He had already taught Yo-won everything he could. Yo-won immediately knelt and expressed his heartfelt gratitude for Chunma's teachings. Chunma gently reminded him once again that such formalities were unnecessary. Yo-won insisted they were deserved. Chunma had entrusted so much to the generations that would succeed him, preparing everything simply because of a prophecy spoken by a wandering prophet. To Yo-won, such unwavering foresight and devotion were worthy of the deepest respect. Sensing that Yo-won still had something on his mind, Chunma urged him to speak quickly, reminding him that very little time remained. After a brief pause, Yo-won asked if Chunma could reveal the identity of the prophet. Without a word, Chunma casually extended his hand. Smoke gathered throughout the half-collapsed realm of nothingness before taking the shape of a human figure. It was the form of the prophet. The instant Yo-won saw it, his eyes trembled violently. Ignoring his reaction, Chunma declared that his duty had finally come to an end. He entrusted everything to his successor, urging Yo-won to teach that greedy being a lesson and to show him the true weight carried by the title of the Heavenly Demon. With unwavering resolve, Yo-won vowed that he would demonstrate the true power of the Heavenly Demon. Chunma laughed softly, placing his complete trust in his successor. Even as the place where he had existed for countless years crumbled away and his own existence faded with it, Chunma never wavered for even a single moment. A calm smile remained on his face until the very end, and with that, the realm of nothingness completely collapsed. Meanwhile, not far from the northwestern region of Changbai Mountain, a section of the once dense forest had been consumed by roaring flames. Thousands of trees collapsed one after another, reduced to black ash beneath the immense heat. It seemed only a matter of time before the inferno engulfed the entire mountain, yet a massive wall of ice encircling the area prevented the flames from spreading beyond its boundaries. Within that frozen enclosure, the sea of fire surged in a straight line, accompanied by a deafening roar. At the center of the blaze, Gul-wan clicked his tongue in irritation as flames continuously enveloped his body. The endlessly regenerating ice wall had become a constant nuisance, and frustration consumed him as he grew increasingly fed up with it. Breathing heavily, he fixed his gaze on the two battered figures standing before him. Markham's mask had been shattered in half, his body covered in black soot as he struggled to breathe through the oxygen-starved air created by the raging fire. Beside him stood Dan Juchin in his golden armor, equally exhausted. Dan Juchin admitted that Gul-wan was a monster. Although his martial prowess matched their own, the sheer amount of true chi he possessed was on an entirely different level, making it impossible to keep up with him. Markim added that Gul-wan's regeneration had become astonishingly fast over the past hour, leaving little doubt that he had absorbed the Fire Kirin's spiritual chi. In his judgment, the only way to end the battle was to sever Gul-wan's head. Dan Juchin agreed that it was easier said than done. Realizing they had to bring the fight to a swift conclusion, he resolved to extinguish the flames while Markim looked for an opportunity to behead their opponent. Without another moment of hesitation, Dan Juchin rushed straight toward Gul-wan. As he advanced, his hands gradually turned pale from the immense cold chi gathering within them. He unleashed the cold ice heavenly palm art, the ultimate secret technique of the ice flow kick. The instant the freezing chi met the raging flames, massive clouds of steam erupted into the air. The moment the steam concealed everything, Markham made his move. Appearing behind Gul-wan with blinding speed, he swung his sword just as swiftly. When the steam finally began to clear, Gul-wan had already blocked both attacks simultaneously, defending against Dan Juchin and Markim from opposite directions. Realizing their intentions, Gul-wan roared that their plan had been obvious from the beginning and declared that it was already over for both of them. The flames that had briefly subsided under Dan Juchin's cold chi erupted once more, engulfing Gul-wan's entire body as he unleashed the extreme art of the Blade God, Flame Dragon's Ascent. Both Markim and Dan Juchin immediately tried to defend themselves, but the distance between them and Gul-wan was far too short. They were swallowed whole by the spiraling vortex of flames. Seeing the overwhelming technique close around them, Markim urgently called out that they had to escape immediately. The only path out of the inferno lay above them, and as he pointed toward the sky, panic spread across his face. Hovering within the raging flames, Gul-wan raised an enormous enormous sphere of fire above Markham and Dan Yuchen, preparing to hurl it down upon them. Confident that the battle was over, he declared that both of them would soon be reduced to ashes. Realizing the imminent danger, Dan Yuchen slammed both palms against the ground. Drawing upon every last reserve of his remaining energy, he erected another towering wall of ice in an attempt to block the descending flames. This time, however, the advancing inferno carried razor-sharp blade chi within it. The ice wall melted and shattered the instant it came into contact with the flames. With a furious roar, Gulwan hurled the massive sphere downward. The blazing sphere descended with overwhelming force, threatening to crush the two men trapped within the whirlwind of fire. Then, without warning, it stopped in midair. Gulwan stared in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Before his eyes, the blazing sphere that shone like a miniature sun rapidly began to lose its brilliance. Within moments, it shrank dramatically before vanishing altogether. Markham and Dan Jushin, who had been desperately trying to withstand the attack, were equally stunned by the impossible sight. Inside, Gulwan struggled to understand why his flame sphere had suddenly disappeared, wondering if the two men before him had somehow caused it. Rejecting that possibility, he declared that their resistance was meaningless and immediately created another flame sphere. Once again, the roaring inferno descended upon them, yet the outcome remained exactly the same. The massive sphere instantly lost all of its flames before disappearing into nothingness. Unable to believe what he was witnessing, Gulwan slowly turned his gaze toward the figure standing beyond the scorched remains of the forest. At the same moment, Markim and Dan Yushin recognized the newcomer and shouted in unison. It was the lord of the demonic cult, Chun Yo-won. His arm remained quietly outstretched. The instant Gulwan looked at him, an indescribable sense of dread spread throughout his entire body. Deep down, an overwhelming instinct screamed at him. Every hair on his body stood on end, and a chilling premonition urged him to flee immediately. He could not explain the feeling, but every instinct warned him that remaining there meant certain death. Acting on pure instinct, he tried to retreat. At that very instant, a single black line silently crossed the space before his eyes. His pupils widened. A powerful gust swept across the battlefield as the burning sea of flames split cleanly in two. Within himself, Gulwan stared at the black line in utter disbelief. Even the wind itself was being drawn into it. It was as though the line was not merely slicing through the air, it was cutting through space itself. A faint groan escaped his lips. His vision suddenly twisted, then his body split cleanly into two. With a violent tear, Gulwan's body was severed in half. Watching the corpse collapse onto the ground, Markim's eyes trembled uncontrollably as he muttered in disbelief that Yo-won had just cut through space itself. Yo-won silently looked at Gulwan's bisected corpse before awkwardly admitting that he had only intended to sever his arms and legs. Meanwhile, far from the battlefield, Hwang Heol continued moving without stopping for even a moment. Carrying the blade god on his back, he had already traveled more than 20 miles northwest of Changbai Mountain through relentless determination. Deep within, Hwang Heol felt relieved that the bleeding had finally stopped, believing that much of the dark energy had been expelled from his body. Even so, he could not understand what kind of power had forced even the blade god into such a desperate struggle. Setting that mystery aside, he grew puzzled by Gulwan's delay. Nearly an hour had already passed. Then, without warning, the blade god suddenly reacted. Breathing heavily, he weakly ordered Hwang Heol to stop. Hwang Heol immediately halted and turned to him in confusion, wondering what had happened. The blade god slowly lifted his gaze toward the eastern sky. There was nothing there. Not even a single bird flew overhead. His pale face remained fixed on the empty sky as his bloodshot eyes stared into the distance without wavering. Then, with a voice filled with unmistakable certainty, he uttered a single name: the demon god. The gloomy skies that had remained shrouded in rain under the influence of the White Tiger's power suddenly cleared. The summit of Changbai Mountain was littered with countless corpses. Near the frozen lake, the cultists worked together to pull Fengbo's body from beneath the ice, shouting encouragement to one another as they struggled to lift it free. Sanghua urged everyone to give everything they had for the final effort, only for Hobam to jokingly insist that Sanghua should be the one working the hardest since she was the strongest among them. Sanghua immediately threatened him in return return, prompting the others to continue their work without pause. Elsewhere, the remaining bodies were steadily gathered into one place under the direction of Baekji and Chae Takim. As they urged everyone to move faster before the sun set, the cultists continued collecting the dead in preparation for their cremation. Standing beside Chun Yo-won at the summit, Chun In-ji quietly observed the scene below before remarking that although Yo-won possessed the strength to be utterly ruthless, he also possessed kindness. Yo-won calmly replied that his decision had not been for the sake of the dead, but entirely for the god of the East. Understanding immediately, Chun In-ji smiled and nodded. Yo-won had granted permission for the warriors of the Berserk Saber to receive proper cremation because he wished to honor the righteousness that Ark Wui had upheld throughout his life. Amid the cold wind sweeping across the lone stone peak of Changbai Mountain stood a solitary tombstone bearing the inscription, God of the East, Ark Wui. Yo-won had personally carved it from the rocks surrounding the frozen lake. Deep within, he acknowledged Ark Wui as the greatest martial artist of them all. In his final moments, Ark Wui had surpassed both the Blade God and Yo-won himself. Without relying on an essence core or nano, he had reached the absolute pinnacle of martial arts through nothing but his own human ability. To Yo-won, he was truly the strongest martial artist to exist in that era. Chun In-ji then asked whether Yo-won intended to begin eliminating the remaining members of the Berserk Saber of the 6 martial arts sects. Yo-won shook his head, explaining that there was somewhere he needed to visit first. Curious, Chun In-ji asked where. Yo-won answered that they first needed to examine the encoded text Chun In-ji had copied while he was held captive. The reminder immediately brought understanding to Chun In-ji. Within himself, Yo-won was convinced that the original manuscript had been written by the Berserk Saber God. It should reveal how he had intended to alter the future. Although the Berserk Saber God had escaped while seriously wounded, Yo-won knew those injuries alone would never kill him. To defeat him, he first had to uncover his true objective. Chun In-ji agreed that the location was already along their route back. Yo-won nodded. Since the sun would soon set, they would cremate the bodies before departing early the following morning. Suddenly, a violent impact echoed across the mountain. A scream followed immediately after. Yo-won and Chun In-ji turned toward the sound at the same instant. It had come from the still frozen lake. A tremendous surge of energy erupted from the decapitated corpse of the wind-white tiger. The one who had cried out was Elder Mong Mu. He had collapsed onto one knee, clutching his stomach tightly as his face turned deathly pale from the rapid loss of blood. Mong Mu narrowly escaped death as Hobum intercepted the attack at the last possible moment. The whites of Sanghwa's eyes had turned completely red. Her appearance alone was unsettling, but what truly inspired fear was the sinister black haze engulfing her entire body, radiating an overwhelmingly vicious aura. Deep within, Hobum was stunned. Sanghwa had suddenly become unimaginably powerful. Although he had always surpassed her in internal energy, the amount of chi she was now releasing far exceeded his own. At that moment, she stretched out her free hand. Her weapon instantly flew into her grasp. Hobum stared in alarm, realizing she intended to wield the axe against him. Without the slightest hesitation, Sanghwa swung it. Startled, Hobum immediately expanded his internal energy into a protective barrier around both himself and Mong Mu. At the same time, he apologized to the 6th Elder before forcefully throwing him out of harm's way. The instant Mong Mu was clear, Hobum coated his hand in sword chi and caught the descending axe with his bare palm. Even protected by sword chi, the impact sent intense pain through his hand. Realizing this approach would not work, Hobum concluded that Sanghwa had completely lost her senses and decided that subduing her was now the only option. The hand gripping the blade suddenly ignited with flames. Sparks burst outward as the axe rapidly heated up, the scorching temperature spreading from its blade to its handle. Yet Sanghwa never loosened her grip. Smoke rose from her burning palms, carrying the acrid scent of scorched flesh. But she showed no sign of pain, as though she had completely lost the ability to feel it. For a brief moment, Hobum hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Then, a devastating kick slammed into his left ribs. A cry of pain escaped him as the tremendous force hurled his body through the air. Hobum crashed onto the ground and barely managed to struggle back onto his feet, but the broken ribs left him unable to move. The one who had attacked him was Ko Wanghul. His eyes had also turned blood red. The surrounding cultists froze in shock. Just like Sanghwa, Ko Wanghul was shrouded in the same ominous black haze, radiating a terrifying and violent aura. In his hand, he held a sphere roughly the size of a human head. It was the Wind White Tiger's other essence core. Confused voices immediately erupted among the cultists as they demanded to know what was happening. Seeing the altered states of both Sangwa and Kowang-hul, Samachuk stood frozen in bewilderment. Within himself, he observed the unmistakably sinister energy pouring from the two of them. His gaze shifted toward the sphere in Kowang-hul's hand as realization slowly dawned upon him. It appeared to be another essence core hidden within the Wind White Tiger. Before anyone could react, Kowang-hul moved at the speed of light. His left fist struck Samachuk with tremendous force, sending him flying backward before he could defend himself. At the same instant, Sanghwa attacked from behind, swinging her axe without the slightest hesitation. Then, both of them suddenly dropped to their knees. Kowang-hul, who had been preparing another punch, collapsed first, followed immediately by Sanghwa. Though they struggled to rise, an overwhelming force kept them firmly pressed against the ground. Chun Yo-won had arrived. He alone had suppressed them. A frown crossed his face as he looked at the black sphere clutched in Kowang-hul's hand. Despite his earlier warning to remain cautious, they had still fallen victim to its influence. Within himself, Yo-won concluded that both the spiritual energy and the demonic essence contained within the essence core had entered their bodies. The increase in their chi far exceeded what was possible from consuming only the blood of a mythical creature. The demonic essence itself was the true danger. Even so, Yo-won, having completed the demonic path, completely overwhelmed them. Yo-won calmly extended his left hand. The black essence core instantly flew from Wang-hul's grasp into his palm. Seeing that, Hobam, still clutching his broken ribs, urgently warned Yo-won that the core was dangerous. The moment it touched Yo-won's hand, the savage demonic essence within the core attempted to invade his body through his palm. Yo-won merely smiled. He remarked that it seemed the core itself had gone mad. In the next instant, an overwhelming demonic aura erupted from his body. Compared to the power radiating from Yo-won, the demonic essence released by the black core was insignificant. Within Chun Yo-won, the powers of all 5 essence cores had already merged into one. Having comprehended great nature and completed the demonic path, he had transcended even the limits of the spirit beasts themselves. As though seized by fear, the violent energy within the black core immediately began to subside. Its demonic essence was completely suppressed. Watching the scene unfold, Hobam stared in astonishment. The ominous aura emanating from the demon lord dwarfed the demonic essence contained within the dark essence core to such an extent that the two could not even be compared. The surrounding cultists could only watch in shock as Yo-won effortlessly subdued the core's sinister power. Yo-won, however, remained completely composed. Cold spread rapidly across the black core. Yo-won stated that freezing it with the cold ice heavenly art should prevent it from expelling any further demonic essence. Samachuk immediately acknowledged his command. Now only one task remained. Samachuk couldn't understand why the two of them were behaving that way, prompting Yo-won to explain that the demonic essence contained within the essence core was taking control of their internal energy. When Samachuk urgently suggested expelling it, Yo-won acknowledged that it was possible, but warned that doing so would inevitably damage their Dantian. Alarmed, Samachuk pointed out that leaving them alone could allow the demonic essence to consume them completely, turning them into demonic humans. At the mention of demonic humans, Yo-won paused before realizing that it presented a viable solution. An hour earlier, after learning that another essence core might still be hidden within the White Tiger's corpse, the 6th Elder, Mong-mu, along with Wang-hul and Sanghwa of the 6 Swords, had begun searching for it. Although the White Tiger was already dead, its flesh and carcass remained unbelievably tough. Neither internal energy nor ordinary weapons could cut through it, forcing them to dismantle the body with sword chi instead. As Sanghwa questioned whether another essence core could truly be inside, Mong-mu remained certain, trusting that if it was the Demon Lord's order, it had to be there. Wang-hul quietly admitted that although faint, he could already sense something within. Proceeding with extreme care, Mong-mu sliced deeper into the carcass. A strange light emerged from within the White Tiger's flesh. Mong-mu immediately recognized it as the White Tiger's 2nd essence core. Wang-hul instinctively sensed the ominous aura radiating from it, prompting Mong-mu to remind him of the Demon Lord's warning. Before touching it, he had to completely protect his hands with true chi. Wang-hul enveloped both hands in true chi before cautiously reaching for the sinister black core. The instant his hands made contact, the ominous energy pierced straight through his protective true chi. It happened happened so quickly that he had no chance to expel it. His entire body stiffened as he became completely motionless. Startled by his sudden silence, Sanghwa called out to him. Receiving no response, she rushed forward, attempting to remove the black core while shaking his shoulders. The moment her hands touched him, the same ominous energy surged into her body. That was the last thing either of them remembered. As the vicious energy engulfed their bodies, its demonic nature seized control of them, causing hatred and anger to swell uncontrollably within. Then everything changed when another overwhelming force entered their bodies. It was far purer and vastly more vicious than the original energy. Before long, the once rampaging power merged completely with them. A violent shudder ran through both of their bodies. Everyone watching could only stare in shock. Just moments earlier, the pair had been consumed by demonic energy, charging about with murderous intent. Now they sat cross-legged on the ground, silently meditating. Deep within, Yo-Won confirmed that they had finally stabilized. The circulation method he had created by adapting the heavenly demon sword art was successfully restraining the demonic essence. From that point onward, everything depended on them. If they succeeded in completely subduing the demonic essence, they would inherit the spiritual chi of the mythical creature. It did not take long. The cocoon of black haze surrounding them unfurled like a blooming flower before vanishing into the air. As the haze disappeared completely, both Wang-Hul and Sanghwa slowly opened their eyes. Hobom immediately noticed that their eyes had returned to normal and anxiously checked whether they were unharmed. Samachuk also sensed that the aura surrounding them had changed, feeling distinctly different from before. Wang-Hul stared at his hands in disbelief as black haze rose from both palms. The embodied demonic energy radiating from them was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Simply sensing it allowed him to feel how drastically it amplified his power, leaving him with the overwhelming impression that he could crush anything before him. A voice suddenly came from behind them. Yo-Won observed that they had finally awakened. Both Wang-Hul and Sanghwa immediately dropped to one knee. Filled with embarrassment, Wang-Hul apologized for failing to heed Yo-Won's warning. Despite being told to exercise caution, they had still made a grave mistake. Yo-Won dismissed the blame, admitting that the fault was his. He had underestimated the true power of the demonic essence contained within the essence core, and acknowledged that he should have retrieved it himself instead of sending them. Wang-Hul expressed his sincere gratitude, knowing they had survived only because of Yo-Won's intervention. Sanghwa also thanked him before respectfully asking about the strange power now residing within her. After circulating her energy according to the method Yo-Won had guided her through, the demonic essence had settled inside her dantian, yet she still did not understand what it truly was. Yo-Won explained that the energy was demonic chi, a destructive force born from demonic essence, completely different from the pure and sacred energies cultivated through Buddhism and the path of the immortals. It was the name he had given to this power, and it was also the origin of the demonic humans of the heavenly demon divine cults. If the cult's martial artists mastered demonic chi, they would be capable of standing against enemies who wielded the spiritual chi of mythical creatures. It became the foundation of a new path. Just as the founding heavenly demon had once prepared the cult for the threats of the future, Yo-Won had now laid the groundwork for a future heavenly demon divine cult that would one day continue without him. Time passed, and by the second night, the heavenly demon divine cult had finished cleaning the battlefield and begun descending the mountain. The cultists carried blazing torches as they marched down in orderly lines through the darkness. They reminded one another to watch their footing, while those reaching the bottom first were instructed to prepare the barracks without delay. The orders were acknowledged at once as the procession steadily continued its descent. At the mountain's summit, only Yo-Won and Moonku remained, quietly looking down at the line of departing cultists. Remembering that she had said she wanted to tell him something, Yo-Won asked why she had not spoken yet. Moonku's face instantly flushed red. Seeing her hesitate, Yo-Won called her name in confusion. She repeatedly steadied her breathing, clearing her throat over and over before finally gathering enough courage to speak. With visible nervousness, she timidly asked what he thought about becoming a father. The unexpected question made Yo-Won frown in confusion as he began to repeat her words, intending to ask what she meant. His body suddenly froze. Holding her trembling hands, he quietly asked if she was Unable to meet his eyes, Moonku lowered her head and shyly nodded. Joy overwhelmed Yo-won before he could even find the words to respond. He simply pulled her tightly into his arms, embracing her with unrestrained happiness. Before he could say anything further, Nano's voice echoed inside his mind. A danger had been detected. At that very instant, something shot toward them at incredible speed. Yo-won reacted immediately, catching a tiny needle cleanly between his index and middle fingers. Moonku stared at it in surprise, recognizing that it was a needle. Yo-won's expression hardened as he demanded to know who had dared launch such an attack. Nano immediately identified the presence of an individual wearing a stealth suit. Yo-won's eyes trembled as augmented reality activated before him. Within the augmented display, the figure of a person standing some distance away came clearly into view. Outraged by the attack, Yo-won told Moonku to wait for him before vanishing in an instant. Moving with incredible speed, he reached out and seized something invisible. Although nothing could be seen with the naked eye, the space where his hand closed rippled violently. The person trapped in Yo-won's grip struggled for breath, coughing as his airway was slowly crushed. Barely able to speak, he desperately pleaded for a chance to talk. The moment Yo-won saw his face, his eyes widened. It was Director Chun, the very descendant who had once injected the nano machine into him. Deep down, Director Chun was thrown into confusion. Yo-won's reaction made him wonder whether he had somehow been recognized, even though he had deliberately excluded every record related to himself from the nano machine. The possibility that something had gone wrong immediately crossed his mind. His original plan had already failed, forcing him to travel to Russia in search of the arm-severing demon Emperor. Instead of finding the Northern Sea Ice Palace destroyed as history had recorded, he had discovered it being rebuilt. The events unfolding before him were diverging too greatly from the history he knew, making him question whether the Blade God had altered the timeline. Still gasping for air, Director Chun struggled to pry Yo-won's hand away as his breathing grew increasingly difficult. Yo-won demanded to know why he had targeted Moonku. Director Chun hurriedly denied any intention of killing her, explaining that he had only planned to put her to sleep with a tranquilizer gun. Yo-won paused at the unfamiliar term. Nano immediately analyzed the projectile, identifying it as a tranquilizer needle used with the TG-3100. Yo-won replied that he understood what a tranquilizer was, but asked what a gun meant. Nano explained that it was a weapon that fired projectiles using tamp powder, but added that restrictions prevented it from releasing the manufacturing manual. Yo-won then questioned why Moonku had needed to be put to sleep. Director Chun hesitated, unable to answer immediately. Before he could respond, Moonku arrived beside them. Looking at the captive with astonishment, she asked whether he was the man who had tried to kill her. Her question left Yo-won momentarily speechless. He had no way to explain the truth. He could hardly reveal that the man before them was a descendant from the future who had attempted only to render Moonku unconscious. At that moment, Director Chun transmitted his voice directly into Yo-won's mind through telepathy, explaining that this very situation was the reason he had tried to put Moonku to sleep. He added that time was running short and requested that Yo-won ask his follower to step back. The word follower immediately caught Yo-won's attention. It seemed that whether because it had never been recorded in the Heavenly Demon Order's history, or for some other reason, Director Chun did not know who Moonku truly was. Internally, Yo-won realized that the situation could not have become more unfortunate. This interruption had come just as they were about to discuss something of immense importance. Even so, he knew he could not simply ignore the man standing before him. Yo-won looked at Moonku with a gentle expression and softly addressed her. He told her that if he had understood what she had said correctly, then this was the happiest day of his life. His words instantly turned Moonku's face crimson. Overwhelmed by embarrassment and happiness, she became too flustered to respond properly, repeatedly waving her hands in panic. Yo-won gently asked whether she could postpone their conversation for just a little while, even though it might disappoint her. Still blushing, Moonku quietly nodded. Yo-won explained that there was something he absolutely had to discuss with the man before them, and asked her to descend the mountain with the others first. Moonku readily agreed before turning toward Director Chun. She sternly warned him that he did not appear mentally stable based on his behavior, and declared that if he attempted anything against the Demon Lord, she would never forgive him. Director Chun nervously assured her that he understood. Deep down, however, he couldn't help wondering how he was supposed to harm someone like Yo-won in the first place. Only after delivering that warning did Moonku finally leave. Once her presence had completely disappeared, freed from Yo-won's grip, Director Chun fell heavily onto the ground, landing painfully on his backside. Suppressing the pain, he shook his head. Although his distant ancestors had been masters of martial arts, the world he came from was nothing like this era. Even so, Yo-won remained a monster beyond anything he had expected. Director Chun slowly reached toward the square pouch hanging from his waist. Yo-won immediately questioned what he intended to do. Looking up with bewilderment, Director Chun explained that he had no intention of attacking and merely wanted to check something. Although still watching him with suspicion, Yo-won withdrew the restraining energy. The moment he regained the freedom to move, Director Chun felt genuine amazement. Even in his own era, where he was considered highly skilled, he had never been capable of immobilizing another person solely through internal energy. He then removed a small square device from the pouch. The unfamiliar object immediately caught Yo-won's attention. It resembled the advanced devices NANO had previously shown him from the future. Director Chun repeatedly pressed the image displayed on the surface with his thumb, causing the device to emit a strange sound. Inside, relief washed over him. The reading confirmed that the 7th generation nano machine was indeed inside Yo-won's body. It made sense that Blade 6 had failed to locate it, since it was constructed from gadolinium. This tracking device was the only instrument capable of detecting it. Even so, one question continued to trouble him. There was still the possibility that Yo-won remembered his face from the day the nano machine had been injected into him. Unable to hold back any longer, Director Chun asked how Yo-won knew both his name and his title. Yo-won calmly explained that he had seen it in one of Nano's recorded videos, where a man named Dr. Bake had addressed him as Director Chun. The revelation stunned Director Chun. Deep within, he realized that the laboratory had been recording everything. Dr. Bake must have forgotten to erase the video records before the nano machine was sent back. Yo-won admitted that he had many questions, beginning with the reason Director Chun had given him Nano. Director Chun immediately asked whether he meant the nano machine. Yo-won confirmed that he did. At his answer, Director Chun suddenly grabbed his stomach and burst into laughter. The way Yo-won referred to Nano so naturally had made him think of the nano machine at once. Yet Yo-won spoke of it as though it were an actual person. Yo-won frowned, unable to understand what was so amusing. Sensing Yo-won's displeasure, Director Chun immediately restrained his laughter. When he had first seen Yo-won 5 years earlier, he had been nothing more than a young boy. Now, however, the overwhelming pressure Yo-won radiated far surpassed even that of his own father. Yo-won resumed his question, asking why Director Chun had given him the nano machine. Before he could finish, the man interrupted and apologized, explaining that Director Chun was not actually his name. Yo-won looked at him in confusion. The man clarified that Director was merely a position, much like the title of an elder in the current era. Yo-won then asked for his real name. The descendant introduced himself properly, explaining that since Yo-won had already seen the recorded video and likely understood part of his identity, there was no longer any reason to conceal the truth. He respectfully dropped to one knee and formally greeted his ancestor. He introduced himself as Chun Musong, the eldest son of Chun Mujin, the 117th leader of the Great Heavenly Demon Order. He then paid his respects to the arm-severing Demon Emperor, the 24th Lord of the Heavenly Demon Order, his own ancestor, Chun Yo-won. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Until next time, happy watching!